Here we go. Today is Sunday, September 11th, 2016, and this is episode 170 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Hey, Jerry. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Sorry we missed last week with Labor Day and Dragon Con and travels and all that jazz.
Yeah, it was a busy weekend, and then I had to travel the rest of the week, so
yeah,
we just didn't get a chance to connect.
That's what happens when you're such an important executive like you are these days.
Yeah, clearly.
You know, podcast leader in demand.
That's right.
But it is September 11th, which is kind of an important date here in the U.S., I guess around the world too, for 15 years since the terrorist attack. So that's kind of a somber thought. And of course, our thoughts go out to all those affected. And it's crazy. You know, it's kind of crazy to me that 3 more years people will vote who weren't even born on September 11th.
Yes. My kids, well, especially my oldest was telling me, I think he's the really the first generation that they've taught that doesn't really remember it.
Wow. Well, for another show, I suppose, but it is September 11th. But we will still try to keep it entertaining and light, but did want to at least acknowledge the important day. So, anywho.
Indeed. So, before we get started, just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers, unless it's just coincidence.
But for, at least, low 7 figures, we'd be happy to represent your opinion.
That's right. Everybody has a price.
It's true.
So we have a fun basket of stories this evening. The first of which comes from softpedia.com, and the title is "Retiring Sysadmin Fakes Cyber Attack to Get Away with Data Theft." So an unnamed sysadmin at an unnamed company,
and apparently in an unnamed country,
was preparing to retire. However, he apparently had aspirations that his retirement savings could not handle, including buying a seaside home somewhere in a different country. So, obviously being the intrepid sysadmin that he didn't let that stop him. And I guess it's a little unclear how this happened, but somebody approached him about illegally purchasing data from the company he worked for. And so this person, just prior to his retirement, concocted a plan where he basically decided that he was going to steal the data and basically do that under the cloak of a web defacement. And so he went apparently across the border and ran a vulnerability scan tool against a website of the company's, and then drove back. Apparently logged in to the administrator console, defaced the web page, said that it was defaced as a protest against the company's support of globalization, and then informed his superiors that the site had been defaced and recommended that they rebuild it right away, which they actually did. And apparently he made a fatal mistake, and he contacted the hosting company, and the hosting company, this part is not entirely clear to me how the hosting company circled back with the employer, but the hosting company pointed out that the defacement had actually happened through the administrator portal, which was locked down to only IP addresses. It was accessible from only IP addresses at the company, and and a few other odds and ends. Ultimately, when the guy was confronted, he admitted that he did it and why he did it, and The thing that this is becoming more and more problematic, I think, as IT becomes more and more commoditized and the skills required are becoming more commonplace. The administrators, we have to think about them as a potential source of. I mean, even security people ourselves are a potential source of risk.
Both intentionally and unintentionally, when we
Yes.
start looking at ransomware or keyloggers or screen loggers that might get on a system unintentionally could disclose a ton of information if a sysadmin were targeted by that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this one's interesting. I'm impressed that the company was smart enough to bring in an outside consultant to look at it, and that they were willing to consider the possibility this was an insider, as opposed to just kind of sweeping this under the rug and moving on, which
Right.
was nice. They made a couple of sort of assumptions in here that I'm not sure I completely agree with, which was they suspected that this was an insider because the commercial vulnerability scanning tool that the sysadmin used while he was quote unquote out at a security conference on the website was expensive and hacktivists couldn't afford that. Well, let's not be so hasty to make that determination. And it came from a public IP as opposed to Tor, which is 99.9% of people will come from Tor. Well, again, I think that's a strong assumption.
Yeah.
You're assuming two things: that all hacktivists are smart and skillful, and all hacktivists are poor. It only would use open source tools. You think if a hacktivist is using Tor, they couldn't go find a hacked copy of that particular expensive vulnerability management tool with a broken key or something from a torrent site?
Well, also think about if you think about it in terms of Venn diagrams, what does the overlap of, quote, hacktivists and corporate IT security people look like?
Indeed. And I often look at things through the view of a Venn diagram. I am awesome at parties for that, let me tell you.
I bet you are.
It's true.
Indeed.
But interesting. And this is one where, going back to your point, we do have to start keeping in mind, not that we haven't, but it reinforces the possibility of insiders. Now, this is pretty interesting because this is a money motivated attack.
Right.
And what's kind of interesting by this is that apparently somebody approached him for this information. And this is kind of downplayed in this article. But, as he was getting ready to retire it, he received an offer to sell the corporate data from somebody, which is interesting because now we're back towards something being initiated probably in some sort of corporate espionage or, corporate competitive landscape asking for this information. So I wonder how often that's happening. And, if you've got some disgruntled employees, especially in IT, it makes them more susceptible. This goes back to sort of the psychology behind various foreign intelligence agencies or even our own trying to approach useful assets with either money or women or whatever it is that they think their weakness is to get information.
Absolutely.
So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing that didn't get a lot of play in this article, but
yeah, they didn't say really anything more about it. Whether it was this person seeking it out, just that somebody had offered him some money. It does seem awfully coincidental, but we just don't know. So the next, go ahead.
I was just say it's one thing to keep in mind if you're going through layoffs or you're going through downsizing or you've got a lot of disgruntled people, it might be time to keep a sharper eye out for this sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking of keeping a sharper eye out for things, the next story we have is...
Wow, that was a hell of a segue. You are a true professional.
I'm taking podcast classes at night.
Really? Is that from the same folks who do Hooked on Phonics?
Yeah, although ITT just went out of business, so I'm not sure what I'm going to do now.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other story that's kind of ugly.
Yeah. So anyway, the story here is that the House of Representatives Oversight Committee what, I don't know if their official title or the official title of this report is Committee on the Oversight and Government Reform, U.S. House of Representatives. The title is The OPM Data Breach, How the Government Jeopardized Our National Security for More Than a Generation.
What do they really think?
Yeah,
Wow.
it's a 241-page document of kind of unfettered unhappiness.
So we're going to spend the next 5 hours of the podcast talking
Yes.
through this document.
We'll give you some time to go get popcorn.
No, no, I'm kidding. But it's big. It's a big PDF. Now to be clear, this is the main report that was put out by the government on what happened with the OPM hack. So there's always politics involved with these sorts of things, but nonetheless, it's ugly.
Yeah, I mean, there doesn't seem to be. I haven't read all of it, but I've read the majority of it, and it does seem to be relatively factual. At least it reads as if it's factual, not as this person was bad or incompetent or whatever. But the interesting thing in this report showed aspects of this breach that I really didn't understand up until now. So, for instance, there were actually two distinct breaches, and they kind of overlap in time. The first breach happened in 2013 and 2014, and happened over a pretty protracted period of time, and was detected by U.S. CERT. U.S. CERT detected someone exfiltrating data. Upon analysis, they figured out that it was security manuals for some of OPM's systems, and that didn't really go anywhere. So the OPM and U.S. CERT built a plan to evict this this adversary, and unbeknownst to them, as they were building that plan and actually executing the eviction, someone else, possibly the same group, there's actually some attribution in this report. Take it for what it's worth, right? The report indicates that it's two different groups, but there's a pretty clear assertion that the two were working together. That the second breach was using the data obtained from the first breach. So anyway, the second breach happened while the first breach response was underway, and was not detected in the in the investigation and response to the first breach. So they continued on, the attacker, I should say, continued on with access for quite some time. And in three distinct campaigns, they stole the background check data, which I think we all remember. It's the was it the SF86? Is that the right number? It's the background forms, right? Anybody?
Right. So when you're applying for security clearance and whatnot, and you fill out all that information, and includes all of your friends' information, all of your neighbors, your employers, and things like fingerprints.
Yeah, well, they didn't get the fingerprints until the third round. So the
Right.
the second round,
My bad. They all blend together after a while.
the second round of data theft was actually all of the employment records.
Right.
And then the third batch was the fingerprint data. And what was interesting, though, from a timing perspective, that each one of those breaches appeared to be, or at least according to the report, appears to be somewhat distinct and happened over a pretty extensive period of time. Now, what was I'd say that there's a couple of really damning things in here. The first off is that the report points out that the Inspector General of OPM, apparently since 2005, had been banging the drum about how horrible security was at OPM and how far behind they were other parts of the government. And for instance, OPM had not implemented two-factor authentication, which ended up being kind of the critical factor here, right? The way that at least the second actor broke in was through compromising a third-party contractor, Keypoint, who was an outsourced background check company. And that company admitted that one of their employees had been compromised, had their credentials stolen. That permitted the attacker to get into the OPM network with an unauthorized set of credentials. They used a lot of different, the attackers used a bunch of different tactics, apparently, including such novelties as registering a couple of domains like opmsecurity.org and opmtraining.org under the names of Steve Rogers, who's Captain America, and Tony Stark, who is Iron Man.
Well, it depends on what iteration of the Marvel Universe you're looking at. In certain comics, they are no longer those characters. They've moved on, and other people have assumed those. Oh, sorry, go on.
Wow. Well, that changes everything.
I just want to be accurate.
So
I'm gonna go back to reading my comic books now.
Sure. So anyway, I guess as all of this is going on, OPM, it seems like is starting to come to grips with how significant the problems are, and they bring in Cylance to give a demo of their product, and of course they do. And Cylance apparently finds all sorts of malware and helps them do some cleaning up. And then they also bring in another company called their product is named Cypher, Cyfir. I forget the name of the company right now. And they found a ton of malware as well, and also helped in responding. Now, one of the things this report points out is that it's actually not. It's against the law for a federal agency to accept voluntary support from a third party to perform services. Right? It has to be done under contract.
So they have to pay for it in some way.
They have to pay for it in some way, but they didn't.
Wait, whose support did they get that wasn't paid for?
This company that makes Cypher. It's I forget the name of the company.
So it wasn't a POC of some type. They were.
Well, they had brought this company in to do a POC, and in the process of doing the POC, think about this this organization's completely compromised with malware. Apparently, like everything is compromised. So they're doing a POC on their live environment, and they're finding malware everywhere. And so they said, "Hey, can you come help us clean this up?"
So it went past the actual POC. Because here's the interesting, you could say a POC is kind of like free services because you're testing of technology.
No, they asked this company to come in and help perform some cleanup, and they spent a couple of weeks on site. And then there's some allegations about how the leadership of the OPM really did not accurately characterize what was going on when they testified under oath in front of Congress. And there's actually a lot of complexities there based on the time frame. But one of the things that came up was that the initial breach back in 2013 and 2014, as I mentioned, stole some security manuals, and in an early report, the CISO characterized that as just some outdated documentation that was stolen. And then later, they had to admit that it was old documentation. However, because the systems were so old, no one knew how to use it. They needed those documents in order to figure out how to steal the data. So it's a really not a good look. To me, this is a fantastic read from a defender's perspective. They have a really extensive list of recommendations, and none really shockingly surprising, right? But kind of good reminders. And I think the thing that was most interesting to me was that OPM had all this stuff available to them, right? It wasn't like it wasn't novel. It was just that they didn't do it,
right?
And they in in the government here in the U.S., you have to operate your systems under, I think it's called a AO. It's a I forget the name of it. Anyway, it's a certification to operate your IT environment. And there's most of their environment had not had that, or it had lapsed, which, to some extent, you can certainly criticize the CIO and the CISO and maybe even the head of the OPM, but at some point you have to start turning the spotlight higher than that, right? Especially if you have your inspector general for a decade banging the drum saying, they're out of control. It's, something really bad is going to happen. They're not properly protecting their data. They're not keeping up with the threats. They're not acting as other government agencies are. At some point, doesn't it become the responsibility of somebody higher than that after the third or fourth year of the same kind of report? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of fault here.
Yeah, there's clearly an oversight failure here somewhere. There was no consequence for this sort of problem to continue to go on and on and on and on and on. It just sort of...
Yeah, exactly.
It seemed like they could just keep doing it.
Right. And that I think that's, to me, that's the most significant thing, and also the thing that doesn't really seem to be prominent in the report, at least so far as I've read. There doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion about the failure of that oversight. They talk a lot about the failure of the CIO and the CISO and the more technical aspects, but they really don't address at least that I've been able to read yet. They don't address the failure to properly exercise governance over the whole thing. I mean, that was the whole purpose of the Inspector General. I mean, if you're not going to pay attention to the reports, why do we have them? So
yeah, but this feels like a very common problem in a lot of organizations that either they're overworked, overwhelmed, don't know what they're doing. It's easy to point out problems. How do you fix them? Were they not given the budget? Were they not given the people? Were they not given the right skill set? Were the leaders just sweeping it under the rug? Did they just not even truly understand? I mean, we can go into any business in the world and say, okay, these are some gaps you have in security, and that business can go, oh, yeah.
Yeah, but let's play off that for a second, and now we'll have to consider the public company concept, right? So in a public company, at least here in the U.S., you have to have an audit committee, which is a subset of the board of directors, and there's an internal audit function of the company who reports functionally to that audit committee.
And how often do you think that they're being completely independent and not in any way being influenced by the reality of the budget situation of the company?
Well, I believe that the reports are. I guess here's where I was going, right? Mm-hmm. So the internal audit team is, and we bemoan this, frequently. The internal audit team are usually relatively, on their own planet in terms of what they're looking for, and if anything, they're usually more critical than they should be. And my expectation is that the message that gets reported up is often probably relatively critical. And I guess my point is, if there is a problem with resource allocation and whatnot, it's in the context of a public company, that should be the board of directors saying, Mr. or Ms. CEO, it is your responsibility to right that wrong.
Right.
And if you're not going to do it, then we're going to find someone else who will.
Sure. If the board cares.
If the board cares, that's right. And if they don't, then I guess that's a different problem. Now, I don't know where on the continuum this particular situation was. I just don't know. But
well, and the question I have is, you're sitting in OPM at the level to make these decisions, maybe you weigh what's the consequences.
Yeah, and I do think, and we've talked about this in the past, I really do get the impression that OPM really did not have a handle on the criticality of their data.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think it's one of those things that only made sense in hindsight. And maybe there were people in in the government that that could have known or did know, but clearly the people in OPM, or at least the leadership in OPM, didn't have a cogent understanding, or they weren't creative enough to understand what the strategic importance of that data was.
Right. Which, by the way, I think is a very common problem throughout most organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure, by the way, they probably felt awesome that hey, our background checks are stored in a different system than our employment information, and that's stored in a different system than our fingerprints. And so, what's the likelihood that all three of them will get compromised at the same time?
Apparently, pretty good.
Yes.
Well, not the same time, but nearly the same time. So I think the takeaway for me is that this is a great example of not a failure of technology, but a failure of leadership and a failure of decision making.
Yes.
Which is a really tough place for a good security person to be. So then if you're in that situation, you're a good security person, what's your morale going to be like? You're going to leave, most likely.
Right. And by the way, there was in one of the recommendations, and I know this has come up quite a bit, one of the recommendations from this report is to, it's kind of interesting too, because the OPM is involved in this process. But here in the U.S., there are limitations on how much government employees can be paid, and there's a lot of discussion about how the government is not competitive salary-wise with private industry, particularly in the area of cybersecurity skills.
Right.
And apparently there is a mechanism where they can pay a higher salary, but it takes some additional exception approvals, part of which is owned by OPM itself. So kind of interesting. But they did encourage the government to take a stronger look at how to pay better market rates to attract better talent. So interesting stuff. So moving on to our next story, which comes from CNN.com, and the title here is 5,300 Wells Fargo employees fired over 2 million phony accounts. This is not typically the kind of story that I would cover, but the sheer scale of this is just, it's incredible. So the story is that since 2011, over 5,000 Wells Fargo employees had been running effectively a fraud scheme, right, where they were opening up checking accounts and bank accounts and credit cards for other legitimate bank customers, and without these customers actually knowing that those accounts have been created, and that they were literally
or in some cases saying no to that account and the person creating it anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
And that ended up with fees being charged to the customers, and apparently they don't talk a lot about the incentive program, but it sounds like there were bonuses and incentive compensation tied to fees paid and accounts opened. So I can only think that you can't get to 5,300 people. I mean, that's not like two people. It's not like an Office Space style scam. I mean, that's like a small town.
Yeah, it's huge. and so a couple of thoughts that immediately come to mind for me is that compensation drives behavior. And I saw this so often when I worked in sales. If you tie compensation to a certain goal, that will drive behavior. And what you have to watch for is, will people then start violating ethics to get to that level of behavior, to get to that goal?
Yes.
And, some have alleged that leadership had to have known about this being this widespread. I don't know. I can't say yes or no on that, but this is a great example. And where I see this tie back into information security is getting through compliance and audits.
Well, that's exactly the point I wanted to raise. We have to
Yeah.
be really careful when we design programs that have incentives tied to them because we people they're just hardwired to figure out how to how to game it.
Yep.
I on Twitter I told the story. I won't mention company names, right? But my wife used to work for a company, an auto dealer, or sorry, an auto manufacturer, who they had this suggestion program, and the idea was that if you saved a couple of dollars per car, that resulted in millions and millions of dollars per year in savings to the company. And so the automaker ran a suggestion program where employees, particularly those on the assembly lines, could make recommendations on how to, on cost savings ideas. And they thought they were pretty clever because they had, they made sure that an employee couldn't claim cost savings on something that they created themselves, which makes sense, right? But what they didn't count on was engineers and production people working together, where the engineers would add some component, some useless component, and then somewhere down the line, a production worker would come along and say, that part really doesn't make sense, and they would submit a suggestion to remove it, and save $5 or $10 per car, and then they would get a significant amount of money. I mean, there were some people who were making hundreds of thousands of dollars off of this program a year, and then allegedly split it back with the person who designed it in, and it just points out that there are perverse incentive programs, and it does pervade everything, and we have to be really careful and cognizant that when we create security programs in particular that have some incentive component tied to it, you've got to be careful on how you make sure that it's not being abused, and it's very situational. There was another great story someone pointed out to me on Twitter. It was the Indian Cobra story. I don't know if you've ever heard of this one, but it was a long time ago. I don't remember exactly when, but there was a snake problem in India, so they put a bounty on snakes. So if you killed snakes, you could bring the dead snakes, I guess, to the city hall or whatever, and they would give you money per dead snake. Well,
Sure.
what these people would do is they would catch them and they would breed the snakes.
Compensation drives behavior, man.
And so we just have to be really, really careful. And so when you think about it in terms of like, I know there's been some discussions about providing incentives or awards for people who detect phishing emails and things like that. And you have to be really careful about the incentives that you're creating. And anyway, there's lots of examples of how this can go wrong. But I do think that at the end of the day, one of the things we have to be aware of, and kind of this story points out, is it's really all about mitigating fraud and mitigating risk, and they just didn't do it here.
Yeah.
To their credit, allegedly, they hired an investigator to come in and unravel this, but it's really not clear if they did that after the Consumer Financial Protection Board got involved or not. That's not really clear. But you know what? They're going to have to pay, I think it's almost $200 million in fines, and then a couple $1 million in restitution.
It's a big, big, big fine.
So,
and it's huge. But I think there's some interesting takeaways here for our world too.
Yeah.
And it's something to keep an eye on. And I see this behavior all the time in many, many different companies where, oh boy, the auditors are coming in. Let's make sure we can get past the audit.
That's right.
Right. As opposed to if we really cared about being compliant, it wouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
anyway.
So moving on to our next story. This one comes from IEEE Spectrum, and the title is Facebook Engineers Crash Data Centers in Real-World Stress Test.
I love this story. It
is a great story. It kind of goes into the whole chaos monkey style thinking that we've talked about in the past. But basically the deal here is that in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, Facebook realized that some of their data centers, some of their major data centers were in the path, and they got to thinking, well, gosh, what would happen if if one of our major data centers went down, and so they put together a program to put together a plan to improve their resilience so they could suffer something like that. But obviously you don't know if it's going to work until you test it. And so the novel thing here is that they kind of swallowed hard and shut down one of their data centers. And in fact, it was apparently during the last was it the major soccer tournament, right? Forget the name of it. Damn.
The World Cup?
World Cup. I wanted to say U.S. Open, but that's tennis. God. I'm getting old.
It's tough getting old. I know.
Anyway,
sorry.
So yeah, I thought this was a great story because it kind of points out that you really don't understand if your program is going, especially your resilience program, and to some extent your security program, is effective until you actually test it, and test it, in real world circumstances, like shut off the data center.
Yeah,
what
really
happens?
Actually test it, right? And Delta learned this lesson the hard way recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
As did Southwest and United.
Yeah, many others. Yeah, I'm not picking on Delta, but
right.
And I think many organizations who have this assumption around our DR plan or whatnot works fine, but have they ever truly, actually, real world, had the guts to just throw a switch?
Right. And there's an interesting discussion in here about how the head of this program was meeting with someone, and they had gotten to the point where they were ready to test, and they were having a conversation, and the person said, "Well, you're not actually going to do it, right?"
Right. You're not that insane, are you?
And in fact, they did. So I really think, especially this is much easier to do early on, right? When you're a younger company and you have a smaller infrastructure, if you build things from the ground up with the understanding that you're going to do this, you have the chaos monkey concept where there is no net. You're not making an assumption that your data center, if you have multiple data centers, that they're going to be up. You're going to test. You're going to turn one of them off, and the expectation is that things have to continue running, and that drives. Speaking of incentives, right? That drives a different kind of behavior when we're architecting the environment and developing the software. And I think that's the right way to go about it. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of management commitment because it's going to be more expensive.
Yeah, as I was reading this story, I was like, wow, that is such the right way to do it. But I really think very few organizations have the resources, the time, the funding, and the management support to actually build that and do it. Because you need a lot of free time with your people to actually be able to get to that level of maturity.
Yes.
And I think most organizations are just barely keeping their head above water with everything they have going on.
Right.
So you need to be really small or really big, it seems like, from a funding standpoint to be able to do this. So small, net new, architected from the beginning, or really big where you've got enough people, time, energy, and management buy-in to re-architect into this way. But man, this is, if you really want to do it right and you really care, this is the type of stuff that you should be able to do.
Yeah.
But it's expensive, very expensive.
It is. And I think as time marches on, companies, this is just my view, right? It is very difficult And we all know this, right? We have legacy systems, and it's really difficult to go back and retrofit everything. However, if you even just plant a flag in the ground and say, from here on out, these are the design principles, and this is how things are going to be tested, and this is how it's going to run. At some point through attrition, you're going to get your entire environment onto that new platform. But again, it still takes commitment and will cost. And by the way, I want to say that this is a difficult thing to say, right? Because it may not be a truism for everyone, but if you continue to do things as you do them today, it will probably be more expensive. However, if you take a step back, you may actually end up, kind of net zero, or maybe you can save some money if you redesign your IT processes and development processes and whatnot. I've been learning a ton about in recent time about managing extremely large environments, and I just don't think that a lot of organizations are completely bought into the automation and whatnot that's possible. And I think as time goes on, and we take some of these forcing functions like this, we may end up in a position where we can end up with better, more resilient infrastructure and saving some money. But that's a really tough.
But this goes back to the same equation and calculus we have to do with security spending: is what's good enough without overspending. This is the same problem that we run into all the time with executives. Not problem, but the same decision that leadership has to make of how much do you spend without overspending.
Right.
To what level makes sense?
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of this comes down to, is for very mature organizations that are also very profitable, they can probably more easily argue, hey, let's go to this level of maturity. For other organizations, there may be a very tough decision being made at the board level saying, we know we're not mature enough, but we just can't afford to spend that much of our budget on this problem.
Yep. And at the end of the day, it's a risk trade-off, right? I mean, it comes down to the individual business. If you're a local florist and you don't rely on your website very much, that's not going to make sense. But if you're Facebook or you're an online retailer or something else, it does. And I think that the other thing I would say, in particular, we should hopefully be learning from each of these things. We have to impart some creativity to understand the actual implications of these things, right? So when we say that we don't need our website available that much, do we really understand what that means?
Right.
And do we really understand what it means if if we skimp out on some security control and our data is stolen? Do we really understand what the implication of that is?
Or are we surprised down the line?
Yes.
Or do certain low-level folks deep in the engineering ranks understand it, but perhaps can't articulate it well, or don't know how to communicate it well to executives, or they choose to disagree?
Right. That's right.
I mean, we make little choices every single day that accepts risk. And I think you're right. I don't know that we do a very good job as organizations understanding the risk we've truly accepted.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of like you look at, I don't know, just something like pen testing, where somebody in the organization say, you cannot pen test my application because it's fragile and I don't want you to take it down. Okay. So we're now balancing the risk of not taking down a production application versus not understanding security holes that may be there that a bad guy could exploit. Which risk is bigger? What's more important to the organization? There's not a perfect answer there.
Right. Well, as long as it doesn't get compromised.
Right.
See, that is the fundamental problem I see happen over and over and over again. People make a risk decision, but they think that means. I just think there's this perverse understanding of what it means to accept a risk, because inevitably, when that risk, when that risk materializes, you have the people who made the decision saying, "How could that possibly happen?"
Right. Or yeah, and again it goes back to incentives. If the person making that risk decision is measured on uptime of that application in the short term, the risk of a pen test taking that application is a higher likelihood to them than the risk of a bad guy taking down that application.
Absolutely. That's right.
So of course they're going to say no, don't pen test.
Right.
But
You're
then you need
swapping off
something
a certainty for a, or
right.
near certainty for
Whereas, which is why it's awkward and inappropriate to have somebody at that level make that decision, because they only care about uptime of that application in the short term.
Right.
So you have to get to the level in the organization where you've hopefully got executives who understand the different trade-offs of risk and are keeping them all in mind. Now, that in and of itself is a heck of an assumption.
Right.
Because then the flip side is you've got security folks who all they care about is security risk. We're as guilty as that on the flip side.
Right.
So and there is no right answer. Every organization has a different calculus they have to make around this. And this is what makes this so frustrating. And by the way, who knows if we're getting it right?
Yeah. Yeah. If the breach never materializes, were you lucky, or I think one of the main horizons of development for IT and IT security is figuring out how to get those equations right.
Yeah.
I just don't think there's a great answer yet. But
agreed.
Anyway, moving on to our last story. This one comes from Bloomberg, and the title is Cisco's network bugs are front and center in bankruptcy fight. I can't.
This feeds into a lot of our other discussions today too. This is a pretty wild one.
Yeah, I can't think of any other case like this. But so here's the deal. There's a game. I think it's like an iPhone app called Game of War Fire Age. I think is that the one that Arnold Schwarzenegger does the commercials for? I'm not sure. Anyway,
I'm not sure. I'll look it up while you're.
There's a company that game is made by a publisher named Machine Zone, and Machine Zone outsourced the back end of the game to a company called Peak Web. And the contract between Machine Zone and Peak Web has a pretty strict SLA of like minutes of downtime per year. And over the course of, I guess, a couple of months, they were Peak Web kept having hour-long outages or so related to its network equipment, and then so there were some unhappiness back and forth between Machine Zone and Peak Web about that, and then it culminated in a 10-hour-long outage last October, where the network, I guess as a router, was kind of pooped out. And prior to this, by the way, Peak Web had been working with Cisco to try to figure out what's going on. They were trying to get Cisco to fix it, and Cisco kept saying, "Yeah, you're bothering me, kid. Go away." and so apparently this protracted outage gave the Peak Web people enough time to actually poke at it. They realized exactly what was going on. They found apparently some command was exhausting memory on the router. They reported it to Cisco, and Cisco shortly afterwards released a patch for that problem. However, Machine Zone decided to terminate its contract with Peak Web as a result of its inability to meet its contractual uptime commitments. And so, of course, this is going to go into court because Peak Web says that the contract they have states that they're not responsible for outages caused by some third party like Cisco. I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I don't understand how that would work because Cisco was not a vendor to Machine Zone. It was a vendor to Peak Web. And so that part doesn't really make a lot of sense. But this is the first time I can think of that a software defect of a product has resulted in in this kind of a lawsuit, particularly one that led to bankruptcy.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And there's a lot of interesting takeaways for me from this. The particular switch in question was Cisco's Nexus 3000 model. And we are often preaching, hey, if it's not broke, don't fix it, is the common mantra of network folks, which in this case kind of supports that. This was, I'm guessing, some fairly new code that this problem hadn't been found in another organization yet. So that makes me wonder, if you're running a super uptime environment, which code and product line should you be running? Should you be running relatively new code and new product line? And as I recall, Cisco actually has two release trains of their code. One is a very, very stable, while one has more new features and bleeding and cutting edge. And the Nexus 3000 line is fairly new, relatively speaking. So I wonder, in a situation like this, are you wiser to run older, well-beaten, well-mature hardware and code in a super tight uptime environment than running something new that may have unknown problems in them? Which also contradicts with the concept that we always say, keep everything patched, because a patch could introduce something like this. Right. This is a tough problem to solve. I don't think it's fair to expect them to have a completely separate infrastructure. I don't know. I mean, they were charging $4 million a month, right? But then again, I don't know how much the infrastructure costs to maintain. So they clearly had some operating capital here, though.
Yeah.
But this is a tough one. If you're trying to run a really, really low downtime environment, you got to be careful. And wow, this one's tough. Because the way it looks like these were failing, certainly memory exhaustion that they couldn't trace down is a really tough problem to solve. Especially because, like you said, Cisco is like, well, we got to duplicate before we can fix it. And it's really difficult to find the problem. So I don't know. I don't know if there would have been a different infrastructure they could have built that had automatic failover, and if they knew they had a memory exhaustion, they rebooted them once a day. I don't know. But it's tough in this situation to run code that you don't really own.
Yeah. I think there's really no details, by the way, in the article about exactly what the environment looked like, but I kind of walked away with, in my mind at least, the impression that maybe the environment wasn't completely designed in a manner that would support that high of uptime. I don't know, right? We don't know the specific details of exactly how it was designed or architected, but yeah, I agree with you, right? This is a tough spot. I mean, Cisco's the market leader. You buy them expecting their stuff is gonna support your workload, and I'm sure those switches are not cheap, or those routers are not cheap. So
no, absolutely not. But there's also a ton of different ways you can run them, and we need a lot more detail here. But
right. Right. But the point though is, you made a really great point, which is, you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. Right? If you run older stuff that's tried and true, it's probably not being maintained. Right. And if you run the new stuff, you could end up with problems like this. So.
And, there are always ways to have no single point of failure, but if this was the same gear on the same code base,
right,
that makes it tough to feel for these guys. But without knowing more about their exact setup, who knows if there's something they could have done differently.
Yeah. I can't help but think, though, if you have that high of a uptime requirement, and especially if you start seeing over the course of months, if you're having problems, switch problems or router problems, I feel like I would have acted a little more aggressively to build in some alternative capacity or something. I don't know. I get the impression, by the way, too, that not all between Machine Zone and PeakWeb was well anyway, and so it kind of seems like PeakWeb is saying that Machine Zone was using this as a way to terminate their contract, possibly for other reasons. So hard to say. But anyway, the reason PeakWeb, I don't think we said this right. The reason PeakWeb is filing for bankruptcy is because apparently their primary customer was this Machine Zone, and once Machine Zone canceled their contract, as they allege against the terms of the contract, they had no choice but to file for bankruptcy.
For the record, by the way, Arnold Schwarzenegger shills for a different game called Mobile Strike.
Oh, okay. Well, seems like it was similar, but oh well.
Neither of which I've played, nor do I have time for right now.
Ain't nobody got time for that. Well, anyway, that is the show for this week. So, thanks for listening. Just a reminder that Mr. Kalat and I are going to be at the O'Reilly Security Conference in New York at the end of October. So from October 30th through I think it's November 2nd.
Yep.
There's a conference in New York City at the Hilton Midtown. By the way, it's focused on defense tactics, which is kind of in line with our podcast here. You can use the code security20 to get 20% off if you go to I think it's conferences.o'reilly.com. The CFP for the talks that Mr. Kalat and I will be moderating are open. These are called the Ignite Talks, and the CFP closes on September 30th. And I think
so. These are fun, by the way. So yeah. The concept is it's 5 minutes. The slides auto advance every 15 seconds. So it's fast paced. It's just about anything you want to talk about, but it's kind of fun. It's a new, interesting challenge for presenting.
Exactly. Should be a lot of fun, and we're a lot of fun, right?
Well, some
of us are.
Some would say. I don't think that's a universal decision. I don't know.
Anyway,
and you will be at DerbyCon, but I will not.
I will be at DerbyCon. I'll have the family in tow, so that should be fun,
including Velocipuppy?
No.
Oh.
No
Sec Doggy?
I don't think they allow dogs. That would be fun, though.
Don't they know who you are?
That would be fun.
Don't they know who she is? She has her own Twitter following, for gosh sake.
She does. Anyway, you can find the link to we'll post the link to the CFP and to where to get tickets. And with that, we will we'll call it a show. And if you like the show, by the way, you can go to iTunes.com and leave us some love there. And a special thanks to our Patreon donors. Thank you very much. That's keeping the lights on here. We use just an incredible amount of bandwidth. So thank you very much for that.
Indeed, thank you.
That is most appreciated. And you can visit the website to find the links, including what I just mentioned for the conference, at our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the show on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Kalat on Twitter at Lurg, and you can follow me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And I think we're all pretty active on Twitter. So if you want to interact with us, it's a great place to do it. And with that, we will talk again hopefully next week.
Bye-bye. Have a good week, everybody.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye-bye.